And welcome everyone to our episode 6 extras. I am here with one of our special guests today, Julija Zubac, who I am just really excited to have here. Julija is the Manager of Restorative Communities at the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. The partnership includes a network of 18 public schools serving grades K to 12 inside of the Los Angeles Unified School District. And Julija, in her role, gets to work with teachers and school leaders at creating safe and healthy school cultures and also implementing restorative practices. And so, we had this episode talking all about how to prevent violence in schools, and I think so much of the cultural work around creating safe and healthy spaces is what you specialize in and what you spend your time doing. So I want to start off with just tell us a bit about, restorative communities. What does that mean? What does that look like in school? Because most people in America haven't gone to schools where that was a part of the culture.
Yeah, definitely. I think most of us maybe experienced some of these practices, but they weren't necessarily called restorative justice. And so restorative justice is actually, we call it kind of the newest old thing, right? Restorative justice is actually a pretty ancient set of principles and practices that have been practiced by indigenous communities throughout the world. And really the premise and the framework has to do with the fact that when harm occurs, we really need to be intentional about repairing that harm through the rebuilding of or building of relationships. And so the idea is that when there's a harm that occurs in a school, we don't just want to remove the problem, right, and separate the parties that are involved in the conflict. We actually want to invite them to participate in a process, in a restorative process that seeks to uncover the effects of the actions that occurred, and then try to come to some sort of agreement in order to restore the community, right, or the relationship that was then harmed. And so a big part of it actually is also preventative, right? And so a big part of it is kind of building community intentionally and being really intentional about addressing the social-emotional needs of students as well as adults. And then, of course, a big part of it is also how do we deal with harm when it occurs. And the way that I like to teach it, in particular to students, is really to stress the 3 R's of restorative justice. So the foundational importance of respect, which is the first R, and then the importance of building relationships. We believe that everyone has a desire for healthy relationships, especially in school. And we also believe in responsibility and accountability, right? Because you need to take responsibility for your actions if you want to maintain a healthy relationship, right? And a respectful relationship. So that's kind of how we explain it in a nutshell, but it is definitely pretty profound. And it's also very much related to other practices. So for us, restorative communities really is like this umbrella term. And what fits under that is restorative justice, restorative practices, social-emotional learning, cultural and linguistically responsive teaching, right? As well as trauma-informed practices. And really now what we're talking a lot about is the importance of not just talking about trauma, but of really talking more about healing and how we can center healing practices and make those a part of the school day. So that's in a nutshell what I would say restorative communities is all about.
Okay, so I think in this day and age, restorative justice is a term that many people have heard of around the country because lots of school districts, particularly in big cities, from Philadelphia to Oakland to Chicago, New York, lots of places are talking about restorative justice, and some places are even decreeing on high that henceforth we shall be a restorative district with maybe varied results on the ground.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of skepticism around restorative justice and restorative practices. And so I'm going to put on my skeptic hat for a second. I want you to talk me off the ledge. So, back in my day, Julija, Kids had discipline. You know, we walked to school uphill both ways in the snow, and we just, you know, we had to get our act together if we messed up and we're out of line. And kids today just need discipline, and all this coddling of kids is, you know, is ruining the moral fiber of the youth.
Yeah.
So what do you say to crotchety old me, or maybe not crotchety old me, but skeptic me?
Yeah, I think the reality is, right, that we were raised very much in punitive systems. And so when you propose kind of this paradigm shift and this shift in mindset, it's going to be an uphill battle. And actually what we find that's very interesting is that when we survey our students and our staff, our students will often say, yes, I love when we do restorative justice circle, or I learned about empathy in that lesson on social emotional learning, and I think that's really important. Our staff, on the other hand, will say things like, there's no time for this is not necessary, this is not priority, right? I also don't think the kids are all that into it. And so it's really fascinating that the resistance actually comes more so from the adults than the students, right? And I think that's very telling. The reality is, right, the restorative justice is unpopular with some because it takes time. And I think what we really want sometimes is we want those quick fixes. And so we want to go back to the days when a rule was broken and there was a direct punishment that would result from breaking that rule, and that would solve the problem, right? But what we found is that our schools were not really functioning as safe learning environments if we were using those punitive measures. And what we find is that our students are actually really craving what I call kind of a humanizing school, right? A school that takes the whole child into account. There's a lot of talk about that in education, right? Teaching to the whole child. Well, children come to school with emotions, right? And children come to school with, the possibility for conflict, right, to arise. And the reality is that if we want for that conflict to fester, we can certainly use punitive practices as a quick fix, but we don't think they actually solve the problem, which is really that harm, right, that can affect an entire school community and actually can impact a student for the whole school year. I mean, I really want us to think about how a kid that made a mistake, right, and was maybe suspended or was disciplined harshly, right, how that impacts them for the whole school year, right? So that child is now maybe feels ostracized in the school community. They feel labeled as a bad kid, right? That's how everyone talks about them. And really throughout, that's going to affect them throughout the school year because they're not going to necessarily see themselves as a scholar, right, which is really why we want them to be in school. And they're not going to believe that the adults have faith in their capability to change, right? Like, if we do not have faith in our young people to be able to improve their behavior and to change, right, then who do we have faith in, right? Like, we have to have faith, I think, in our young people, and we have to be examples really as adults, of not just these kind of, authoritarians who are there to keep them in order, but we're really there as mentors, right? And so if you're going to mentor them and really teach them, right, the right way to behave, I think it's really important to give restorative justice a chance and to give a lot of these kind of new practices a chance. Just to kind of give you an example, when a child can't read, right, we teach them how to read. Right, that's the response. When a child can't behave, right, we want to punish them. So what we should be doing is when a child cannot behave, what the experts tell us is the reason why is not necessarily because that child is manipulative or evil, right, but because they don't have the skills to behave in a different way. So we have to actually teach them. And that takes longer than just punishing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a profound point. It makes me think a lot about the opposite side of what you just said, which is like oftentimes the kids who persistently can't read, right, are also the kids who feel like the interventions to teach them how to read are like punishment,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
and not actually helping them feel empowered and learning to read. So interesting analogy there. a thread that I'm hearing running throughout what you're saying, and something that came up a lot in our discussion during today's episode, was this idea of connection. Connection between kids and adults, connection between kids and kids, connection between kids and the community. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what is so important about connection, and also drawing back to the idea that we discussed in the episode about preventing issues of violence on school campuses.
Yeah, interestingly enough, the example that comes to mind for me about the importance of connection is actually from my own personal life. So I'll share that example, and it has to do with knowing your neighbors. And I shared earlier that I'm actually a war survivor, and I am from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in the 90s, many of you would remember there was a war in our country, which was really vicious. And what I learned during that time, I spent about a year in that experience. And what I learned, even as a child, I noticed very quickly the importance of the support networks that we had in the apartment building where we lived. So it was really essential that my family had a good relationship with most of our neighbors, so that when push came to shove and we really needed help, even though there were differences among us, there were ethnic differences, religious differences, we assisted each other, right? And that was because we trusted each other. And there's actually a lot of stories that come from Bosnia that talk about giving the keys to your house to your neighbor for them to keep it safe, right? And the level of trust that we had, right, with our neighbors, to be able to entrust them with our property like that, even though we knew maybe they wouldn't be able to protect it, but that level of trust was really vital. And we're a very communal society. And I think that there's something really missing in American society, that we just don't live in that kind of communal society, right? Like, we don't tend to know our neighbors. And I think the schoolhouse in this country is a really important center of our society, because not in every country does the school also have extracurricular activities and sports and lots of different kind of opportunities for the youth to have meaningful things to do, right? And so the school, I think, in the United States is really key. And so the reason why I think connection is so important in the school building is because if you care about your classmate, right, and if you care about your teacher and your principal and et cetera, and everyone in that building, right, the chances are you're not going to want to harm them, right? And that's just the reality, and that's something that I've learned in my own life through personal experience, and that I've also witnessed as an educator, right? And the classrooms where I spent more time intentionally building community, right, and making sure that my students knew that I cared about them as human beings and I wanted them to care about each other and that we were really a classroom community, those were my best classes. And I know that as a teacher, when I didn't do a good enough job of building community and continue to do it throughout the year, I would have more behavioral issues in that class. And that was just the reality of how I think human dynamics work, right? They say that in order to, I appreciate how science kind of thinks about this, right? So they say that what we want to do in the school building, right, is we want to increase the level of oxytocin, right, which is like the love hormone, and we want to decrease the level of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, right? And so how do we do that, right? Like, this is scientific, this is not just some theory, right? But really, oxytocin increases in human beings when we're connected to each other, right? When we have meaningful conversations, right? When we know little anecdotes from the other person's life, right? And so it makes it a lot harder for me to want to hurt you if I know how much you care about your brother, right? Or if I know, a story from your childhood when you overcame adversity. Like, I just think that is a basic human truth, and I think that we really need to put that to work in our schools.
Yeah. It makes me think about the importance of seeing ourselves in other people, right? It's very difficult to have hatred for a person when you can see yourself. within them, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So maybe to close, I want to hopefully pose a bit of a provocative question. And I think you certainly work in schools, and we work in schools that are in communities that are grappling with a lot of challenging issues, violence in the community, issues with gangs, conflicts that can make the neighborhood be an unsafe place. And there's legitimate concern about that conflict or violence spilling into the school. And I think, in a more suburban context, it might be something more like we're just worried about another Parkland situation, or in a more rural context, that might be the case as well. But there's legitimate fear about, sort of keeping out the things that for the time being, at least, we know are dangerous or threats in the world. And so in that context, right, where it's like, there's an immediate rational desire to keep kids safe and prevent these dangerous things from spilling into the school community. How do we do that without maybe doing some of the things that you mentioned earlier that are maybe in the end counterproductive?
Yeah, I mean, I think that reality is something that our educators that I work with are faced with every day, and that I was also faced with as a teacher, especially when I worked in Watts. And there were many lockdowns, and there were many shootings and many threats in the community that certainly were very scary for the adults as well as the children in the building. I actually think that many of our schools do a really good job of keeping our students safe in urban communities. I think that's a story that we don't hear often enough. Many of our students have shared with educators that I work with that school is actually the safest place in their communities, and it's where they feel most relaxed, is where they are least afraid of someone hurting them. And so I think it's important to mention that the staff in our schools are really doing a fantastic job at de-escalating situations when they arise, and also going into emergency mode, right, when you need to go into that mode. So I think that there's a lot of common sense practices that we need to continue in our schools. I am not against lockdowns by any means. I think those are important safety measures that we need to continue in our schools. And again, I think there's a lot of value in connecting with the community, in connecting with parent leaders and community leaders in the community who are going to be able to support the school to respond to those threats when they arise, right? And also to maybe even hear about the possibility of a conflict happening off campus, when so that they can take those measures to keep the students safe. So I think there's a lot of work that even our school police in LAUSD have done to improve the way that they are policing the community, and I definitely respect that. I think community policing is something that works much better than the kind of informal policing that we see in most of our communities. And community policing really has to do with building relationships. Again, very similar, right? Building relationships with folks in the community so that you're much more aware, much more proactive, to deal with those threats.
Yeah. Well, Julija, thank you so much for taking some time to join us today. I think your experience and expertise have really shed a lot of light and hopefully for our audience helped enlighten people to an aspect of the work in schools that maybe isn't something people remember from when they were a kid and maybe isn't as transparent as some other aspects of what's happening in schools today. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you. And folks, as always, you can find all the content from our shows, other segments from episode 6 or extras at our website. That's aotashow.com.